Thanks for joining us. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, How Spirion Helps Accelerate GDPR Compliance. I'd like to introduce our presenter. Joining us today is Corey Rutherford. Corey is a solution engineer at Spirion, specializing in security architecture and data management. Welcome, Corey. Please take it away.
Thanks, Abby. Greetings, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on how Spirion helps accelerate GDPR compliance. So again, my name is Corey Rutherford. Not only am I a solutions engineer, but I'm also a former user of Spirion for more than 10 years in the real world scenario. So as I go through the demo and presentation today, I will be talking to the way I actually use Spirion to help us accelerate various regulation processes. So today's agenda includes a Spirion and GDPR overview. We'll have a quick set of slides, about 5 minutes worth, and we'll jump into the product demo, which will take up the remaining of the time. And then, like Abby had mentioned towards the end, we will have a Q&A to discuss Spirion a little bit further. So Spirion, back in the day, also known as Identity Finder, is a company that's been around for 12 plus years, and its sole product was designed to find sensitive data with very few false positives and with a 98+% accuracy. So Spirion's a leading tool for sensitive data discovery because the development of its technology for the past 12 years has been focused on locating and reporting on sensitive data. We've done an excellent job with this because of our maturity as a company, our agile development framework, and building a product around the customer needs. Sensitive data definitions, which we'll talk about a lot more, are definitions used to find sensitive data. Let's talk a little bit about GDPR. So GDPR and using Spirion will help you accelerate your discovery process and acknowledging the regulation in many ways, such as through inventory, being able to discover accurately the very sensitive data with the organization, being able to classify information, and also being able to locate data based on its geographical location, data flow, accountability, being able to monitor what actions have been applied to remediating data, notices through email, trap notification, things like that. And also creating a data awareness through various notices, icon overlays, which we'll talk about, and various stub files that help inform your end users of such actions and how they apply to various regulation and policy within the organization. The ability to audit for events, and also security system integrations to existing systems you may already have in-house on-premise, such as encryption technologies, maybe network monitoring, email management systems, CASB, SIM tools. Spirion basically will allow you to integrate with all those tools, so you don't have to change your existing processes. What you can do is use Spirion to help further augment those systems to better the process overall. So creating an inventory of sensitive data as it pertains to GDPR, you need to find data as it applies to the European data geographically. So you need to create a data inventory of that information. And when it comes to data, data is not all created equally. So Spirion finds data for the country of origin. A Swedish address, phone number, or driver's license is not the same as a UK equivalent. Spirion finds data for these European Union countries specific to that geographic nature. So for example, national IDs, ethnic groups, date of birth, address, telephone number, driver's license, passport. We also find things like email address, IPv4 or 6 addresses, gender, religion, ethnicity, a large amount of different types of requirements that you're going to be faced with when it comes to GDPR compliance. Spirion searches everywhere. This includes data repositories for unstructured data such as email, text, and file server information, and also structured data such as relational databases and spreadsheets. So we search cloud-based storage provider locations such as Dropbox, Amazon Cloud Drive, Microsoft Office 365, G Suite, BoxSync, and various other cloud storage providers. This also includes Exchange mailboxes and SharePoint sites, both the on-prem and also the hosted environment. We search common internet file system shares, so CIF shares, Microsoft Samba or DFS shares, network file system mounts, and NetApp devices such as your NAS devices. And we're also very capable of scanning databases such as Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, MySQL, Postgres, Sybase, DB2, and many other flavors of databases. So as you can hear, we can scan a lot of different data repositories. So Spirion is an on-premise software solution, meaning you deploy it to your own servers on site and manage all that data that is discovered. So Spirion won't have access to any of this data at all. You can deploy this within your own virtual environments, such as ESX or Hyper-V, or you can also deploy it to your hosted environments as well. Spirion has a central software web console accessible by any major web browser and allows you to view sensitive data, its locations, data types, data classification, and various other attributes of those files. The technology provides a client and a clientless deployment method, which reports results back to the central web console, which is the consolidated location for any and all results. The Spirion Workstation client can be installed on Windows devices, Mac devices, Red Hat Linux machines. That allows you to search servers, desktops, laptops, and many other types of endpoints for various data types. And then we also have a Spirion Remote Agent, which is the same software that you would deploy on Windows or Red Hat. However, in this scenario, this allows you to scan for remote locations on endpoints that do not have the actual agent installed. So this process allows you to scan remote locations with a single or a multiple number of these Spirion agents, which form teams, which can scale out your Spirion infrastructure indefinitely when you're scanning larger data stores by distributing that scanning process across many Spirion agents. So let's take a look at the Spirion environment. So what we are looking at here is the Spirion console. Across the top, you have multiple tabs. Moving from left to right, typically you increase in the technical capabilities of the software. But starting with this tab called the Spyglass Dashboard, this provides a real-time high-level overview of search results across your organization. The presentation of this dashboard provides an easy-to-understand interface that can be leveraged by IT professionals, non-security personnel, and decision makers, such as management. So it provides the ability to drill into the discovery results through these various sections known as widgets. So these squares are widgets, which provides a unique ability to really understand the types of data in your organization visually. So for example, this top widget here is known as the data timeline. It's an adjustable timeline that allows you to select time slices, which basically helps you understand data trends. So for example, as you can see, these peaks and troughs are indicators of when large amounts of data have been found and very little data has been found. So over time, you can see a generic baseline for that. So this particular month, I was scanning and I noticed that there was a very large peak to that data that it was discovered, more than double the typical data I would see throughout the month. So by seeing that visually, I was able to identify there was a large set of data that was discovered. In this case, it happened to have been a file migration. So we had a local file server. We copied all that file data to OneDrive because we were doing from local to hosted premise type solution for file server access. So this is a great way to actually key in on those events. This is also very likely scenario for an end user who intentionally meant to copy maybe a single file or folder, but incidentally copied an entire folder structure. So that is data exfiltration at its classic state. That's something that happens all the time. And that's why being able to discover data at rest and data exfiltration are of such consequence when it comes to GDPR and other regulatory oversight. So having the capabilities here is very useful. You can also use other widgets, such as the sensitive data heat map widget. This provides a visual representation of where your largest risks of data exist. So each one of these clusters represents a logical grouping of data repositories. You can group these, as you see here, by departments. You can also group it by data repositories. You can also group it by Active Directory organizational units, which can be imported directly from Active Directory. So we do have full integration into Active Directory, both from the device management perspective and also from the security groups and user perspective. And you can group these data assets customized by your organization. You can also see these assets by, let's say, users. So if you want to understand which users have the most sensitive data, you can see that by the bubble types here. So cluster size represents the amount of sensitive data, and the colors represent your sensitive data exposure. So red meaning high sensitive amount of data, and green meaning less of the sensitive data. This also provides drill down functionality that allows you to view areas of concern and ultimately provides a view into results. So the process will start with you doing a discovery of your data repositories. So what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to either find where sensitive data is on these various repositories, data repositories, or you're also using it to validate what you think is on those devices. In most cases, you're already coming from a data mapping process that you've done through reviews, interviews with individual application owners, things like that. You can use Spirion to validate that and actually find data in places you didn't expect to find it. So an example of this is that I see here my executive group has the highest incidence of sensitive data. It's got the biggest bubble, 906 locations. I'm going to drill into that. So I'm basically double clicking into my executive department. And what I'm seeing now are actually the devices, so the laptops, the desktops for this particular department. I can see this device called Henry has the highest incident of sensitive data. Again, the biggest bubble that we're looking at. What I do know about Henry is that it's henry.internal.spirion.com. So Henry's the friendly name that we're looking at here. Henry is a loaner laptop. It's a laptop that's checked out by our staff quite frequently. So I would expect to see a lot of sensitive data on there, but what you want to do is you want to understand what types of information on there and who is the person that is causing, the pain, as it applies to GDPR, who's copying the most sensitive data to these devices and creating this additional footprint that you may or may not need within your organization. So by clicking into Henry, you now see the Active Directory profiles that have been logged into that device. There are several profiles. That's to be expected. It is a loaner device. This individual obviously has the highest incidence of sensitive data. Also red, meaning it is highly sensitive data, so it's very critical data. So what has happened here now is that because this particular process has been discovered, Spirion has actually taken automated processes to help remediate and protect that data. So what has happened here is that you can see when the individual was using the laptop, they copied data, and then they were using it, they copied more data, and then maybe the weekend came along, and then they copied more data. And then eventually there was no more data being copied. That was probably after the laptop was checked back in for this profile. What you do see here using the sensitive data footprint, which basically provides visibility in your data risk across the organization, which helps you visualize exposure you might have, in any given point in time. So this green section basically represents the total sensitive data that's been found. So it's been consistent. They did one copy and it stayed at that level. This red area here, red section, basically represents unprotected data or data that hasn't had a protection action taken or applied. So what's ended up happening is that using this protected sensitive data widget here, you can monitor the protection actions that have been applied to the sensitive data. And this would be per your standards for applying GDPR protection actions to the particular types of data. 471 files have been deleted per your policy. 453 have been quarantined, so files have been moved to another location. 170 files have been emptied from the recycle bin. So not only did they delete the files, 32 files, but they forgot to empty the recycle bin. So Spirion did that. And what you're seeing here is the trend where the risk was very high, and then Spirion kicked in its automatic remediation processes, and it reduced that risk footprint to 0 in this case. So that process had protected that device because it had removed protected the data in various ways by removing it, quarantining it, and things like that. The next tab here is going to be the results tab. So what this results tab does is it basically shows you the data. So from each match that has been discovered in every document from a search, and allows you to see that data very specifically. So what we see here is that this individual in this owner column is being pivoted by that profile name. However, we're finding data on multiple devices. So not just the Henry laptop, but we're finding it on their Liberty desktop. We're finding it in their Exchange mailbox. We're finding it on their OneDrive, their Dropbox, every place that they have data. You can see the first time that the information's been discovered. You can see the most recent scan that validates that it was still there and something had happened to it. You can see the types of information. Mother's maiden name. Mother's maiden name at first doesn't sound sensitive, but when it's in a database that also has an unlock passcodes for it, so when someone says, "Hey, forgot my passphrase," you're challenged with your mother's maiden name in many cases. So this is actually the type of database that we're looking at here. So it is sensitive. Telephone numbers, not just US telephone numbers, but a number of different telephone numbers for all the EU nations. And we'll talk more about the different types and how they're geographically created. Addresses, driver's license, phone numbers, and many other data types that were there. You can see a preview of it here in this column. You can see how many incidents of that data has been discovered. You can also see the location of that. You can see that we've got C drive, which tells you it's a local drive in a folder called recycler, and it's a class.query file. You can see which actions have occurred. So this information has been redacted, this information here has been shredded, and then we've got various other actions that have occurred by the icon. And then more importantly, your next phase after you've done your data discovery is classifying information. So in this particular setup, I've got 4 different classifications: public, I've also got critical, which is my highest critical sensitive data. I've also got restricted, and I have internal. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. So when it comes to GDPR and classification, there's no perfect quantitative system for calculating the classification for a particular data element. So in some situations, the appropriate classification may be more obvious than others, such as when federal laws require the organization to protect certain types of data. For example, personally identifiable information, in this case, GDPR type information. So in order to do that, you have to be able to find your information very accurately. And we do that in a number of different ways. So this is a list of different types of GDPR data that we look for. This is a high-level list. We have 400 plus different data definitions. that we look for. So you can see here it is by geolocation for a number of different types of identities, and the list is very long. So Spirion also has what we call the Cimmerian Environment Discovery Engine definitions, which is very similar to an antivirus definition. So for example, looking at this image here, when you're looking for an antivirus, you have created a definition that defines patterns and behaviors when you're looking for viruses. So the Spirion sensitive data definition is very similar to that process, where it discovers sensitive data types by looking for patterns. It leverages known validators that have indicated the presence of sensitive data. It uses decision tree process. So if it is a credit card number, we put it through a number of branching logic checks. Is this near a name? Is this near a CVV code? Is this near some other data attribute that further reinforces that this is indeed a credit card number? We use algorithms for each of these. We use contextual analysis, and we also use proximity detection, and all those combination of checks rule out false hits, and it more accurately provides real results with very few false positives. That's the 98+% accuracy that Cimmerian has. This accuracy is also a result of more than a decade of improving these definitions through real-world interactions with customers. So as a result of that, every month we update our definitions that become available to any of our customers. And this is free of charge. Nothing's modularized. You don't have to pay for GDPR definitions. You don't have to pay for updates and things like that. That's part of the licensing when you purchase Spirion. So that's an example of how we are so accurate and how we do such a good job of finding these various types of information when it comes to locating it. So back to the console. Because we're able to find those various sensitive data, we can then create very sophisticated and very accurate workflows around that, and in this case, classifications. So when it comes to classification, as you may be aware, a classification is quite simply just a grouping of information into buckets of a name. So for example, I've got 4 data classifications, and this is completely customizable. So your organization will have different names, taxonomy for these bucket lists. You'll also have different data types for each one of these. So any data that has social security number in it, passwords, driver's license number, banking account information, patient records, things like that is considered critical in my environment. That may not be the same in your environment. It may be called something else. And you may only have 3 data classifications, as I have 4. So most critical being red and least critical being public. And I also assign colors to these. By assigning colors to my data classifications, I start to take advantage of something very unique in Spirion. So as you can see on my desktop here, I have 4 different file types. And you can see I've got these little icon overlays over these. So I've got red, orange, yellow, and I have green. Those data colors or those icon overlays are associated to my data classification. So as an end user, I don't have to remember what critical means or what internal means. I can associate that to colors. And we as humans understand colors, the hotness or the coolness color factor. You can also see that in file servers. So as you're seeing here, I've got a file server UNC share. I can also see that I've got icon overlays for each of these different file types. If I right-click a file, for example, and go to properties, I can also see that within that file itself, I have actually got the classification written into the file itself. So the metadata itself actually sits within the file, which indicates the type of classification it is. So whenever Spirion finds the data and classifies it, that metadata is written persistently into that file. So when I copy a file from this file server to the desktop, or vice versa, or anything like that, that data is actually going to be maintained. So the classification of that file will persist with it wherever it goes. So you can see it right away classified that. And that's because Spirion is automating that process of classifying data. When it finds it, it interrogates it very quickly. It says, okay, what kind of information is in there? Okay, in this case, it happens to be restricted data. So I know the types of restricted data that I have because they're individual grades, maybe employee home address, things like that. So this is where Spirion becomes very useful from the end user perspective. Now we do that process of classifying files through this process we call workflow. So this is a GDPR specific workflow, and everybody knows what GDPR stands for. But in this particular case, I'm looking for these data types: nationalities, country names, vehicle registration, US, UK currency, bank account, IPv4, 6 address, various other things. You can make this anything you want because you define that through this definitions tab. So as you can see here, find any data that contains this type of information. So there's the information I'm looking for. I've got a lot of information I can select from, lots of different choices here. And you saw the list of 400 plus items that I could select from. And by doing that, then you tell that workflow to say, when you do a search and you find that type of information, classify it as critical in this case. I've also added nationalities and country names. I've also added other things like vehicle registration and UKSDD, things like that. And then I've also applied actions to that. In this case, I simply just said classify the data as critical. When I did that and the search completed, that is how these icon overlays persistently were written on these files themselves. And that's the beauty of using Spirion, because it automates that process. So you don't have to manually do any classification yourself. You can let Spirion take that process into the technology that you have written on the business logic on paper and apply that to the technology. Also, by doing that, you can also set up various other rules and notifications. So a great example would be an archive rule. So as GDPR requirements, there's always going to be a data retention component to that. So quite simply, you can write data retention rules to it. If you find data that has that information and it's been created, accessed, or modified over so many years, in this case 7 years, I want to do something with it. So I wanted to do a couple things. I wanted to classify it as one thing. I wanted to classify it as critical, but I also want to quarantine it. I wanted to move it to another location. Find that data. If it's more than 7 years old, move that data to an archive server. So another file server in a hardened network someplace. And that's what Spirion did for me. So it allowed me to do that. But it also created notifications. So I could actually send notifications to individuals. So you can quite simply do that by saying, add email notification. And then email notifications can be sent to different individuals as a result of a process. So a very nifty email notification process was something like this. You can say, when results have come into the environment, I want you to email the endpoint owner or a distribution list or a set of distribution lists, or maybe the person who actually owns the data or who physically uses the device they're on. You can also curate roles, users and roles, so your role-based access groups and things like that. So this really helps you adapt to the audit requirements of GDPR and who gets notified and how they're notified and things like that. And you can customize the email itself, a different subject. You can also put in different variables to basically say, dear Corey Rutherford. So you can personalize the email when it's sent to them. You can let them know, data has been discovered on this particular device, the search time, this is how many matches, the data type, the endpoint, things like that. So because we all work on multiple endpoints, you obviously need to know which endpoint the data was discovered. So this creates yet another level of awareness for them when it comes to finding data and also notifying individuals. The other neat thing about Spirion is not only icon overlays, but the properties on the files, the C classification, but you can also enforce rules. So quarantine, we just talked about that. So when I move a file to my desktop, and let me go ahead and open this file here from the server. This is a PDF file, and it's image-based text. So when you open that, you'll actually be able to see that it does have a lot of information in there, such as credit card number and things like that. More importantly, the image file is crooked, it's not of the best quality and things like that. But what I wanted to do is I wanted Spirion to find on the second page here, credit card number, and do something with that. So if you find credit card number, I want you to quarantine it to a different location. You can also see classification as directly accessible within the menu options for Adobe, Office products, things like that. So when you move it to your desktop, what ends up happening is the file gets moved to another location. But what it does, it leaves behind a text file. This text file is useful because it informs your end user that something has happened with that data. This file contains sensitive data. It's been auto-quarantined to a secure location, and it lets them know. It doesn't have to be a local location. It can be a remote location as well. You can customize this in any way you want. So if you want to provide some shock and awe value to it, that this file has been moved, your data steward has been notified, pursuant GDPR regulations, things like that, you can do that as well. So a lot of really neat things that you can do using this Spirion console. So Abby, I wanted to transition here. Are there any questions that we have so far?
We received a few. So the first one is, does Spirion support scanning Azure environments like Azure SQL or RDS?
Good question. So Spirion can scan any location that has an available ODBC type connection. In this case, this would be the Azure environment. So there are a number of third-party drivers that Spirion leverages to do that. So the answer to that would be yes.
Okay, another one is, thank you. Can the tool be used to select data for one particular individual, say when there's a data access request?
It can. So when Spirion does a search for the various data, we also search the metadata properties of those files, which include the file owner. And you can also search on location as well. So if you have a user profile folder, let's say my folder called Corey, then when I do the search, I can actually specify where I want to do that search to pull those files back. Yeah, good question. And
Okay.
another question?
I believe those are all the questions we have from the audience at the moment.
Awesome. So as we transition to the end of the webinar, some common questions we get, and I just want to address a couple of these here. For database scans, we can check, when we do a scan with databases, we can check actual column names, the column data, so the cell data, and we can also look into schemas, or we can also look into tables. So you can specify down to the database elements you actually want to search. So it's not a scan everything and report back on it. You can actually specify a table you want to search or a column that you want to search. You can also exclude and things like that. So that's something that comes up in a lot of discussions. The second question is, do we randomly sample scans? Yeah, we can do that. So you can do a full scan of a database, but more commonly, as it applies to GDPR, is that because it is structured data, meaning that once you scan the first 100 attributes of a location, the rest of the data is going to be of the same nature. So if a column is credit card and the first 100 hits are her credit card, you can assume that the next million hits are also going to be credit card information because it is structured data. And then the last question we typically get is it possible to create filters to remove false positives? And absolutely. So if you are in a position where you do happen to get false positives, which that is the way it's going to happen, you're going to run into those on occasion, you quite literally can right click within the console itself, a hit, and you can basically say, ignore that from every scan from this point on. And let me just show you that here real quick because it'll make more sense. And then I will also backtrack to the question is, can you scan a profile, basically? So you right click the location that you have here, and you can click ignore this match or this location. You can also globally ignore location or match if it happens to be a false positive. For the question previously, Abby, we had a question about searching, let's say, user locations. Yep, so the clever way that I do that, I've got a PCI rule that I typically use for this. And what I can do is I can say search a location that contains that information. So rather saying than just users, I could say users, and then I could use my username and search that entire folder. And then you can get back all the results for that user, any data that is sensitive in nature. Fantastic question. We are out of time. Abby, do you have anything else?
We did receive a few more questions, so everybody who just submitted a question, since we are out of time, we will go ahead and follow up with all of you personally by email. Thank you for submitting questions. We really appreciate it. Since we are running short on time, I just wanted to thank everyone again for joining us today. Again, a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and a link to this webinar recording will be provided in the coming days. A huge thank you to Corey for an excellent presentation. Really appreciate it. We hope to see you all at future webinars. Thanks so much and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.